In this video, I'm going to do my best to explain the chord note mapping scheme in its simplest terms. So we've got an empty composition here, and I'm going to start with creating a empty phrase on bar 1. Notice that we're in C major. So I'll go up here to my empty, and then I'll right click on that and hit insert, and there's my empty phrase. Then I will double click on that, and that'll take me to the phrase editor, and I'm going to create a quarter note on the first beat on C4, and we're in chord note relative mapping. I can confirm that if I right click on this note, I can see note kind is chord and it's number 1. Okay, so we can see that it's playing, we can see in here that it's playing middle C for 1/4 note. Now, why is it doing that? Alright, if we go up here, when we're in chord note mapping, is essentially a two-part instruction that says that we interpret like this. In the key of C major, play the first note of whatever chord I have in this box here. I'll say it like this. In this key, which is C major, play the first note of this chord. Okay? So, in the key of C major, play the first note of this chord, and the first note of a 1 major chord in the key of C major is C. Okay? Now let's change this to C sharp or D flat major. Now we have an instruction which says in the key of C sharp major, play the first note of this chord, a 1 major chord, which is we call a triad. And the first note of a triad, a 1 triad in the key of C sharp is C sharp. If I change this key to A, let's just change it to G, then we have a two-part instruction in the key of G, play the first note of a triad, of a major triad, and we have G. Okay? Now, let's create a new note. In fact, let's change this note to, I'll drag it. Let's go back to C major. Drag this up to E, note number 2. Okay? So before we were at number 1, now we're going to have note number 2. Let's look at our two-part instructions up here. In the key of C major, play the second note of a 1 triad, 1 major triad, and that's E. In the key of D, play the second note of a 1 major triad, and that's D sharp, right? I'm sorry, that's F sharp, D, F sharp, A, right? What about G? That would be G, B, D, so that would be B, right? In the key of G, G, B, that's what we got, D, G, B, D. What about F? Well, play the second note of an F major triad in the key of F. In the key of F, play the second note of a 1 major triad. And we've got A. Okay, so again, we have a two-part instruction. We have in chord note relative mapping. We have the key and we have the type of chord. Now, let's go back to the key of C. All right. And let's bring this down back to 1, which is the root. The first note of a triad or any chord is called the root. Okay, we have the root, the third, the fifth. In Rapid Composer, these, instead of us saying the root, the third, the fifth, we say the first note, the second note, the third note, because that's how the mapping scheme works. It's a little bit different than designating the root, the third, the fifth. But that basically is how it works. Now, let's drag this C up to G. So now we have an instruction that says, in this key, play the third note of the chord and whatever chord is up here. Okay? Now, what if we change this chord to a 1 augmented? Okay? So a 1 augmented chord in the key of C major, the third note, which we know is the fifth, is going to be G sharp. And there we have it. It's mapped it to G sharp. If we change this to diminished, it's going to be G flat, correct? Okay, so let's try that. Right, G flat. Okay, so let's, all right, so how about a sus? What is, let's think about that. Let's change this to 2, note number 2. Let's go back to major. Okay, so now this is jump to playing E4. And a sus2 chord, the second note in C major of a 1 chord is D, right? So if we're in C major, a 1 chord, instead of major, we want sus2. Okay? And sure enough, note is now on a D. Let's go, instead of a 1 chord, let's do a 4 chord, a 4 sus2 in C major. Okay, so I just click on this number until it turns blue and do 4. So that should be a G, right? That's what we got, G. So the second note in the key of C major, the second note of a 4 sus2 chord is G. Let's change this to a sus4, and on a 3 chord in C major. Now what would that be? Well, the triad on a 3 would be E, G sharp, B if it were a major triad. A sus chord, if it were a minor triad, in the key of C major, 3 would be minor. So we'd have E, G, B. The sus 4 would be E, A, B, correct? So let's do 3. And let's do sus 4. That's what we got. We got the A. Okay? Now, let's do a let's move this. Let's go back to 1 major. Okay. And I'm going to make this a 3. Now, I'm going to right click on this and hit number 4. Now notice what the program has done. The 4th note of a triad, a 1 triad in C major, well, there is no 4th note in a triad, correct? There's only 3 notes in a triad. That's why it's called a triad. C, E, G. In the case of C major, the one triad is C, E, G. So since it can't play, since there is no 4th note in a triad, what it does is it plays the next note up, which it starts the chord over again. So it plays the root. Now you can change that behavior by clicking this button here, ignore non-existent chords. I'm sorry, ignore non-existent chord notes. Scratch that. That actually works a little bit differently. I'll come back to that in a different video. Anyway, let me change this to 4 again. Okay. I'll change this note to 4 and remove the offset. Okay, and it defaults up to the C5 because there is no 4th note in a triad. 4th notes exist in 7th, 9th, 11th, and 13th chords. All right. Now, but if we change this, instead of a triad, if we change this to a 7th chord, let's do a 1 major 7th chord, then the number 4 correctly goes to a B. And by the way, notice this highlighting. This is very useful. And notice that it's the highlighting on the root of the chord it's a green, but it's a slightly paler green than the other chord tones of the chord. So here we have a 1 major 7th chord and it's highlighted. And if we do a 1 minor 7th chord, we see the highlighting. There's the root, there's the minor 3rd on E flat, there's the G, and there's the minor 7th on the A flat. Okay? Okay. Let's delete that. Go back to major triad, 1 major triad in the key of C major. Okay. Now, let's take a look at the scale note mapping. scale note relative note mapping, because that's actually a little simpler. Scale note mapping actually only is a one-part instruction. There's no chord. When we're mapping just to a scale, we don't have to worry about the chord mapping. There is no chord mapping when we're mapping notes to a scale. When we're mapping notes to a scale, we just need to know what scale we're dealing with and what degree of the scale we're mapping to. So the major and minor scales are 7-note scales, pentatonic or 5-note scales. But let's just create a note on C, which is the first degree of a C major scale, is C, right? And here we can see our note kind of scale, and there's 1, and it goes up to 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Okay. Now 8 would be the octave, correct? So if we change this to 8, it jumps up to the C5. The 9th would be a whole step above, so that goes to the D. The 10th would be the F, and the 11th, I'm sorry, the 10th would be the E, the 11th would be the F in C major. Okay, let's go back to the 1, which is the root, the first note of a C major scale. So scale note relative instructions are simple. It's play the first degree of a C major scale. If I change this to 2, it says play the second degree of a C major scale, and that is D, right? So there it goes to D. If I hit 3, the instruction can be interpreted as play the third degree of a C major scale. That's E. If I change this to minor, the third degree of a C minor scale is E flat, right? C, D, E flat. That's the third degree. Okay. The 7th degree, let's change this to 7 of a C minor scale, is B flat. There we have the B flat. The 7th degree of a C major scale is B, natural. There's our B flat. Let's see, how about let's bring this down to 2. What about the second degree of a C Dorian scale? That's the D. What about the third degree of a C Dorian scale? Move this to, well, that should be E flat, right? Yep, E flat. So the third degree of a C Dorian scale, we have the flat third. Of a C major scale, the third degree is E natural. Okay? Now, if we change the chords up here, it's not going to matter. So we have the third degree of a C major scale, and if I change this to minor, nothing's going to change. Now the shading changes. Okay, the shading will show you the chord tone mapping, where the chord tones of a one minor chord will be, but the mapping doesn't change, because when we're in scale note relative, we don't worry about what chords are up here. And that's the point. That's the key point. Okay? So the mapping scheme in its simplest, the simplest way to understand it is, for scale note mapping, we look, it's a one-part instruction. We just look at what scale we're dealing with. Let me give one more example. Let's do a 1, the first degree of a F sharp scale. Well, what's that? Well, that's F sharp. Not very complicated. And there we go. Okay? All right. So to recap, when we're dealing with scale note relative mapping, all we have to do is concentrate on what scale we're in and the degree. Okay, the degree will be will have a number on it, a Roman numeral number. Okay, we can change those up here. It'll have one Roman numeral between 1 and 12. Okay, so all we have to do is worry about the type of scale and the tonic of the scale. I don't want to say root, because I use root to refer to chords, whereas with a scale, really it's the key. We call the in C major we call it the key, or F sharp Dorian. The F sharp is the key, not okay. The F sharp in an F sharp Dorian scale would be the first degree of the scale. Okay, and remember, some scales don't have 7 notes, they have 5, like the pentatonic scales all have 5 degrees. But our major and minor scales have 7 degrees. Okay. So with our scale note relative mapping, all we have to do is look at the key. And with our chord note mapping, we actually have to look at both pieces of information. We have to look at the key and the particular chord in that key. Okay? So that's my simplest explanation of the mapping scheme. I guess I should look at bass note mapping since we're here. Let's do that too. Okay, so we've got this C, we're in C major. Let's change this to a bass note. And there's something special about the bass note mapping, and that is that the notes are outlined in this red border, which gives you a visual clue. And it says bass note in there. So let's change this to C major. All right. Let's bring this up. See what happens. Let's look at our options here. And you notice that in bass note mapping, you cannot select the degree like in the scale note mapping. You can select, 1 through 12. And you can't select the chord number, which is like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, corresponding to the root, third, fifth. All you have is just offsets. Okay? So, what's going on here? Well, let's take a look. Let's change the key. So the bass of a C major chord, bass note, is the first degree of the scale. Okay? If we change this to D, the note jumps up to B. So the bass note of a D major scale is D. Let's change this to G. Goes to G. What about C minor, the bass note of a C minor scale? Well, that's going to be C, right? So it's really just the bass note essentially, not essentially, actually is the first degree of the scale. Okay? So if I do natural minor, it's the first degree of the scale. That's what a bass note is. And then we can use offsets to get like the bass to play the third or the fifth, okay, or the seventh, one of the upper extensions. Okay, so bass note is pretty simple. It's just the first degree of the scale. That's all the bass note is. If I change this to let's say a 1 minor 6, it's still on C4. No change there. So it's not affected. The bass note is not affected by what chord we have selected here. Okay? It's just selected by, it's just determined by the scale, and there's no degree. So that's, in a way, the bass note, we can get the same result by clicking a scale note relative and just selecting the number 1, the first degree of the scale, right? And then of course absolute notes, there's no mapping at all. So if I hit C and I make that an absolute note, sorry about that, it's my dog, she wants to go out. It's just going to be C, and it's also highlighted in red. And it doesn't matter what scale, like even if I select E, okay, it doesn't change. Alright, so that's the mapping scheme for the notes. I'll see you in the next video.